All right, so imagine this. You're trying to build something, right? A house, a ship, even a kingdom. You need the right materials, the right tools, the right people. Everything relies on something else to come together.
Absolutely. There's a chain of dependence, a kind of network of needs and support that underpins every creation.
Exactly. But today, we're going deeper. We're not just talking about what a builder needs to make a house, we're talking about what a house needs just to be a house. What does existence itself depend on?
Now we're getting into the realm of ontological dependence. It's a fascinating area of philosophy, exploring those fundamental relationships that make reality what it is.
And you, our listener, you're the kind of person who loves to unravel these mysteries, who enjoys those light bulb moments when a complex idea suddenly clicks into place.
Indeed. And luckily for us, we've got a fantastic collection of sources to guide our exploration.
Yep, you guys sent in some amazing material on ontological dependence. We've got classic philosophical texts, contemporary papers, even some thought-provoking blog posts.
A veritable feast of ideas. So what's the game plan for our deep dive today?
Well, we're going to start by looking at how philosophers have traditionally approached this idea of dependence. We'll see how they use concepts like possibility and necessity to try and define it.
Yes, the modal approach. It's a good starting point, though, as we'll see, it does have its limitations.
Right. But then we'll move on to some more recent ideas that focus on the essence of things, how the very nature of something determines what it depends on.
That's a crucial shift. It's not just about what must be the case for something to exist, but about what makes that something what it is.
Exactly. And along the way, we'll also touch on some related concepts like metaphysical grounding and how this idea of dependence helps us understand what's truly fundamental in reality.
Sounds like an exciting journey. So let's kick things off with those early attempts to understand dependence through the lens of possibility and necessity.
Okay, so imagine a world where things could be different, where what exists isn't necessarily fixed. This is the world of modal logic, a realm of possibilities.
Right. And the early philosophers trying to grapple with ontological dependence used these tools of possibility and necessity to define different types of dependence.
So let's take a look at the first one, rigid existential dependence. What does that even mean?
Well, in simple terms, it means that something, let's call it X, depends for its existence on something else, Y, in such a way that if U doesn't exist, X can't exist either.
Okay, so like a shadow depends on an object to cast it. If the object isn't there, no shadow, right?
Perfect example. The shadow can't exist without that specific object. It's a rigid dependence.
Got it. But then we have non-rigid existential dependence. How does that differ?
Well, in this case, X still depends on something for its existence, but it doesn't have to be a specific thing. It could be any member of a certain category.
Okay, I think I'm following. So like a wooden chair depends on wood to exist, but it doesn't have to be made from a specific tree, right? Any wood will do.
Precisely. The chair non-rigidly depends on the existence of wood in general, not on the existence of a particular piece of wood.
Interesting. And then there's generic existential dependence.
Yes. This one broadens the scope even further. Here, something depends on the existence of multiple things, not just one specific thing or even a type of thing.
So like a human being depends on oxygen to breathe, water to drink, food to eat. We need all of these things to survive, but they don't have to be specific molecules of oxygen, water, or food.
Exactly. That's a great example of generic existential dependence.
Yeah.
It's about dependence on a category or a class of things.
Okay, so we've got these three types of modal existential dependence: rigid, non-rigid, and generic. But our sources also point out some problems with this whole approach.
Right. While the modal analysis is a good starting point, it doesn't quite capture the full complexity of ontological dependence.
For one thing, it runs into trouble with cases of mutual dependence.
Yes, classic chicken and egg scenarios, like a king and his decree. The king depends on the decree to express his will, but the decree also depends on the king to be authored.
Right, so which one depends on which? It's like they're both necessary for each other to exist, but they're also distinct things.
Exactly. The modal analysis struggles to account for this kind of interdependence, where the direction of dependence isn't clear-cut.
And then there's the issue of dependence on necessary existence.
Yes. This one gets a bit heady, but essentially it's the idea that if certain things exist necessarily, like mathematical truths or laws of logic, then everything else would depend on them.
So like my existence depends on the number two existing. That seems a bit odd.
Right. It feels like it stretches the concept of dependence too far. It's not clear how my being here relies on abstract mathematical entities.
And the final limitation is that the modal approach can be a bit blunt. It doesn't always give us the precision we need to understand different kinds of dependence.
Yeah, it's like using a hammer when you need a scalpel. Two things might necessarily coexist, but that doesn't tell us why they do or what the nature of their dependence is.
So we need a more fine-grained approach. We need to go beyond just possibility and necessity and look at something deeper.
And that's where the idea of essence comes in. It's a shift from looking at what must be true to looking at what something fundamentally is.
Okay, so essence is like the core of something, the thing that makes it that specific thing and not something else, right?
Exactly. And this idea of essence, this whatness of a thing, becomes crucial for understanding its dependencies.
And one of the key concepts that emerges from this focus on essence is identity dependence.
Yes. This is the idea that something depends for its very identity on something else. It's not just that it can't exist without it, but that it wouldn't be the same thing without it.
So like a signet ring with a unique inscription. The inscription isn't just something the ring needs to exist. It's part of what makes that ring that specific ring.
Precisely. The inscription is woven into the very identity of the ring. Without it, the ring would be a different ring altogether.
Okay, so identity dependence is about those things that are essential to a thing's being what it is. And what are some of the implications of this idea?
Well, for one, it implies that if X depends on Y for its identity, then X can't exist without Y.
That makes sense. If Y is part of what makes X what it is, then no Y means no X.
Exactly. And it also helps us address that problem of mutual dependence we talked about earlier.
How so?
Well, if X depends on Y for its identity, that doesn't mean U depends on X for its identity.
Ah, I see. So the signet ring depends on the inscription for its identity, but the inscription doesn't depend on being on that specific ring.
Right. It could be on a different ring or even on something else entirely. Its identity isn't tied to that particular ring.
So this idea of identity dependence helps us tease apart those tangled webs of dependence, clarifies which thing is truly fundamental. Now, what about essential existential dependence?
This one builds on the idea of identity dependence. It states that something, X, depends for its existence on Y because it's part of X's essence that it can't exist without Y.
Okay, so it's not just that Y happens to be necessary for X to exist, but that it's necessary because of what X is at its core.
Precisely. It's like a human being and a heart. A human being can't exist without a heart. And that's not just a random fact. It's because having a heart is part of what it means to be human.
It's baked into our very definition. And then, of course, we have generic essential existential dependence, which expands this to multiple things.
Right. So, for example, a water molecule essentially depends on hydrogen and oxygen atoms. It can't exist without some of each because that's part of its fundamental nature.
So we've got these two main perspectives on dependence. The modal approach focused on necessity and possibility, and the essentialist approach focused on essence and identity. Which one is right?
Well, that's the beauty of philosophy. There's often no single right answer. Both perspectives have their strengths and weaknesses.
Some philosophers think that modal concepts are enough to explain dependence, while others argue that we need essence to get a more accurate picture.
Exactly. It's an ongoing debate, and ultimately, your view on this might depend on your broader philosophical commitments.
So how you see the world, how you understand reality itself, influences how you understand dependence.
Absolutely. And speaking of bigger picture stuff, let's connect these ideas of dependence to some other fundamental concepts in metaphysics.
Okay, first up, ontological dependence and metaphysical grounding. Grounding is like saying that one thing is the basis or the foundation for another thing, right?
Precisely. It's about what makes something ultimately hold true or exist. Like the fact that this table is brown is grounded in the physical properties of its surface.
And how does this relate to dependence? Are they just different words for the same thing?
They're definitely related, but there are some important distinctions. Grounding is often seen as a more fundamental kind of relationship than dependence.
So, like, a house depends on its foundation for support, but the foundation is also what grounds the house's existence. It's what makes the house stand in the first place.
Exactly. Dependence is about a necessary connection, while grounding is about an explanatory connection. It's about what makes something ultimately the case.
Okay. And what about ontological dependence and the idea of substance? Substance is like the basic stuff of reality, the things that exist independently, right?
Right. Traditionally, a substance is something that doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. It's self-sufficient, self-contained.
But how does that square with this idea of dependence? Doesn't everything depend on something else in some way?
Well, that's where the concept of identity dependence comes in handy. A substance might be defined as something that doesn't depend on anything else for its identity.
So its existence might depend on certain conditions, but its essence, its whatness, is independent.
Exactly. And that makes it a good candidate for a fundamental building block of reality.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these ideas all fit together. And finally, how does ontological dependence relate to fundamentality itself? Like the idea that some things are more basic than others.
Dependence relationships can actually reveal a kind of hierarchy of fundamentality.
So if X depends on Y, then Y is more fundamental than X.
Generally speaking, yes. The direction of dependence points to what's more basic, what underpins other things.
And this connects to those debates about foundationalism and infinitism, right? Whether the chain of dependence ultimately ends or goes on forever.
Absolutely. Ontological dependence is key to understanding how reality is structured, whether it has a fundamental base or extends infinitely in both directions.
Wow, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's recap for our listener just to make sure we're all on the same page.
All good.
So we started by exploring how philosophers have traditionally approached ontological dependence using concepts like possibility and necessity.
We saw how they define different types of dependence. Rigid, non-rigid, and generic.
But then we also encountered some limitations with this modal approach, like the problem of mutual dependence and the issue of dependence on necessary existence.
Which led us to the idea of essence as a more nuanced way to understand dependence.
We explored identity dependence, the idea that something's very identity depends on something else.
And essential existential dependence, where something's existence depends on something else because of its inherent nature.
We saw how these ideas connect to other big concepts in metaphysics, like grounding, substance, and fundamentality itself.
It's a web of interconnected ideas, all pointing to the fundamental question of how reality hangs together.
Exactly. And hopefully, our listener, you've had some of those aha moments along the way, those flashes of insight that make these abstract ideas suddenly click.
You've seen why philosophers have developed these different concepts of dependence, how they help us understand the complex relationships that make up existence.
And this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore. You might be wondering, are there things that are truly ontologically independent? What are the implications of dependence for our understanding of consciousness or the structure of societies?
Those are great questions. The sources we've explored provide a fantastic starting point, and thinkers like Kit Fine, E. Jonathan Lowe, and Jonathan Schaeffer offer even deeper dives into these topics.
So keep thinking, keep questioning, keep exploring. And as you go about your day, look around and consider the things you encounter. What do they depend on, and in what way? Thinking through these relationships can give you a whole new perspective on the world, a glimpse into the hidden architecture of reality itself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.